Have you ever wanted to do an extended walking trip? A couple of years ago, my husband did one through part of Italy. I really wanted to go too, but unfortunately I had a teaching engagement at the time and couldn't make it. Another walk, though, that I've been interested in is Wainwright's Coast to Coast Walk. This is one of several walks that go across the width of Britain. And there are a number of ways you can do this. One is you can join an organized group that will walk across. One of the problems with that, however, is that you're walking at the pace of the slowest person. Also, you may or may not want to have conversation partners for 8 hours a day. I kind of wanted it to be a solitary walk when I did it, and so I chose to do it completely alone. Now, with that, however, you can hire a booking company, as I did, to take your baggage from B&B to B&B to B&B all along the way. All you carry is your little day pack. And indeed, they book the B&Bs as well. That's what I did. So the trip begins at St. Bees on the west coast, on the Irish Sea, and it goes all the way across through the Lake District to Robin Hood's Bay on the east coast on the North Sea. The total trip is about 320 kilometers. Although actually if you're using your cell phone to monitor the number of steps that you're actually taking, it winds up being just a little bit longer than that because of side trips to restaurants or places to get equipment, or indeed from getting lost. And you will get lost at some point on this trip. So I thought I'd show you some pictures and video from this, partly for general interest, partly in case people are interested in going, and partly for friends who don't want to suffer through seeing my photos when they come over to my house. So the whole trip took 15 days, and we will go through it pretty much day by day. You may find that you get bored halfway through, and that's totally fine. It begins in St. Bees, and this is indeed St. Bees, the town of St. Bees. It's a nice, sort of quaint little English town, almost the stereotype of any English small town that you imagine if you're from North America. And this is the place that I stayed, the Manor Hotel, Manor B&B, something like that. And that's actually day 0 because that's the day before I got started. And here is, in fact, the morning of the trip. You start out, you walk out from St. Bees out to the beach where you'll find this cairn showing you the start of the coast-to-coast walk. And traditionally, you'll take a selfie here. I'm not a big selfie fan, and maybe from this photograph you can tell why. So one of the traditions on this trip is that you step into the Irish Sea, get your feet wet a little bit, and pick up a rock from the beach there, which you're going to carry with you and transport the whole way across the country and drop it into the North Sea on the other side. Very quickly, you start climbing up out of St. Bees. And there's that, and here's the actual journey that you're taking. Doesn't look like much, but look at those people way in the distance. It actually is fairly steep uphill. So eventually you wind up on the top, and it looks like your stereotype of English coastline, and indeed it is. Here you're going north, you're following the coast for a little bit, so you're not actually making any progress across the country. You're going north up the coast. Eventually, you leave the coast behind you, and you go up this long slope. You even find cairns, like in Canada, where, in fact, you need them because there aren't villages everywhere. Now, I did this in April, which is early for the season. The season, generally speaking, starts in May, and I found that there was virtually nobody on this trek, or not very many at all. Eventually, you descend into a valley, and one of the things that I find after I've been walking for a long while, especially in a foreign country like England, is that if I see any signs that strike me as funny in an exhausted state, I will take photographs of them. So here is the first of those. You wind up with a bit of a childish sense of humor as you go along. Wound up at this pub, and from there was transported to my B&B. I had to be transported back to this exact location so that I could be sure that I wasn't cutting steps off by taxi cab. Most of the places, though, of course, you're just walking straight to the place and then straight out of it. This was one where you couldn't. And that's day one. So here we go on to day two. And here's another of those signs. I really, really hope there is no high school in Cockermouth, because you can just imagine the trauma of those students. You can also tell that England doesn't hire a marketing company to name its parks. And here is Ennerdale Water. Water always makes it sound like something out of Tolkien for some reason. For me, just means lake, and that's what this is. It is a lake that you hike along and along and along. It's actually quite large. You're on the edges of the Lake District here, and eventually you find yourself over on the end of the lake, and you're not even close to being done. You've just started, and you keep going past a whole lot of ragged-looking sheep, of which you're going to see a ton in this. Now, one of the things that you'll find is that the signage on the coast-to-coast walk, and it is legendary for this, it's lousy. It's often difficult to figure out where you're supposed to go. One of the things you can do is you can download a map app that will work offline, so when you don't have Wi-Fi or cell reception. And it will show you like a red line over the course of the map, and you can tell if you're deviating from it in some way. I really recommend that, because if you rely on the signage, you will get lost. And frankly, you will get lost anyway. There's no escaping it. But the poor quality of the signage on the coast to coast is part of the deal. You pass little farms or farmlets, and eventually you're into something that's starting to look like mountains, and mountains unlike I thought England even had. But here we go. And eventually you find yourself in this open country with, way off in the distance, a little house, and that is a YHA, a youth hostel. And this is one of the places that I really regretted I wasn't actually staying. In part because there was a lot of the trail to go, but in part because it was a really lovely place to be. And if you get a chance to stay at that hostel just out of Ennerdale, beyond the end of Ennerdale Water, I would recommend it. But then it's more uphill, more and more and more uphill. And here is a sense of what you're looking at. It's a little bit bleak, and you're going to see a lot of this sort of boggy moor-like stuff. I'm not sure if they call them moors in northern England, but this is the kind of stuff that you're going to see an unbelievable amount of if you're traveling, and indeed on this video as well. And it's a little bleak, but there we are. In most of this, the trail is quite obvious, so it's not too difficult to find your way, but there are places where it vanishes and you're just traipsing over this boggy stuff, which is really, really wet, especially if it's rained recently. And remember, this is England. And eventually you come down out of the mountains into the valley bottom, and this is the area of Stonethwaite, which is pretty nice. Lots of great places to stay there. There's a sort of a series of villages here. I, needless to say, was in the furthest one. And one thing that I noticed that I didn't do is take pictures of all the places I stayed. And I look back and I think, why didn't I do that? But I didn't. Trust me, though, there are a lot of nice B&Bs. Day 3 is Stonethwaite to Grasmere, and when people say that you can do this thing in two halves, you know, the west half and the east half, they will always tell you that the west half is nicer. And in fact, the west half is more scenic. And these first couple of days are really quite nice, although this day, I have to say, the weather socked in. It was raining, it was foggy once you got up into the mountains. In fact, it was cloudy because that's where you were, in the clouds. And so I don't have very many photos of this day. Just as well, this is one of the days when you're most likely to get lost and be staggering around amongst the moors, possibly to be lost forever. But if you're lucky, you eventually get to Grasmere, and then you go on day 4 to Patterdale. And this was a terrific day. Grasmere to Patterdale is probably the single most scenic day of the entire trip. It's a bit of a long day because you're going way, way up into the mountains. Anytime I'm talking to an English person about this, I do air quotes around the word mountains because I'm from British Columbia. But nevertheless, they are nice and reasonably impressive. And there are some little tricky stretches if you take the trickier options in the trail, because there are places where you can take the easy option down the valley or the hard option over the top of the mountains. I tended to do the harder ones, although being completely solitary, I didn't want to do anything where I could slip, break an ankle, and not be found until next season. So this is taken at a kind of saddle above a little mountain lake, and if you look off to your right, there's this trail that leads way, way up. And I thought, I don't actually have to do that, but I decided to do it anyway because it looked like an interesting thing to do. So indeed, I went up that, and you get quite a nice view from the top. And there are other people up here. Grasmere to Patterdale is one of the places that a lot of people go hiking. And so you will run into a lot of people on the trail, and you can see that there's still snow up here. Now this is actually at the top of one of the crests, and then you dip down and then hike along a crest trail. This is not the kind of scenery that you expect to see in England necessarily, at least not if you've been brought up on Downton Abbey and Masterpiece Theatre. Then eventually, way off in the distance, you see Patterdale coming up with beautiful lakes and valley, and that's a great area to stay as well. I suspect really crowded in the summer. Next up, Patterdale to Bampton, and you're back up into the mountains again. Also a nice hiking area over here, so if you just are going for a day trip, staying in Patterdale and then going east one day and west the other is a good thing to do. Farms identify their sheep by spray painting them with different colors. Sometimes it looks like RuPaul has been at them. Eventually you're down into farming country again, and nearby there's this hotel, which you might recognize from Withnail and I. That seems to be their claim to fame, even though the movie is at least 20 years old by now. Day 6 is Bampton to Orton. Most of it's low level today, and you're going through a lot of farmers' fields, including cattle that are eyeing you suspiciously, and yet more sheep. England is interesting in that you can cross over most of these fields, and there are little stiles, which are sets of stairs over the fences. Wind up at the ruins of an old monastery quite close to town, and then rise up out of that over a couple of hills and fields which are really, really wet, unbelievably wet. Of course, it had been raining for 2 days by the time I got there. A little bleak, honestly. Day 7, Orton to Kirkby Stephen, or Kirby Stephen, as people seem to pronounce it. And there was a contest for the world's most beautiful church, and this church did not win. Kirkby Stephen is traditionally regarded as kind of the halfway point, even though it isn't really. You can see I've come 82 miles, I've got 108 miles to go, but those 82 miles are most of the up and down. You've got the largest elevation gains in the first half. Kirkby Stephen is also a somewhat larger town, and it's where some of the transport companies are based, and so you can get more supplies and that kind of thing when you go through this point. Day 8, Kirkby Stephen to Keld. Here are some sheep from the sheep races, I imagine. And sort of treeless hilltops with cairns and so on. And these bird blinds, which I thought would be used by local people every so often, turns out actually that city people come out here and spend thousands of dollars a day to sit or kneel behind one of these things and blast away at birds. Go figure, city life must be quite dull, I would imagine. Not many photos today, and I'm booked into Butt House, again, not named by a marketing firm. Day 9, Keld to Reeth. This is a really great day, especially given the weather on the day that I was there. The trail goes halfway up the hillside, down this long, long valley. Great area to stop for lunch, about halfway. It's quite a long day, this one. And eventually we find ourselves approaching Reeth, where a much-deserved glass of beer is waiting for me. This is the Buck, the inn where I'm staying. And then it's on to day 10, Reeth to St. Giles Farm. This day is mostly through farmland, so it's fairly low level, not very much up and down at all, largely through farmers' fields, including some gates that I think will probably only stump the very, very tired along the way. And then we get into Richmond, another of the quite large towns along the route, and you can hang out there and spend the day and eat dinner or what have you. There's even a castle in this town. But I'm staying outside town at a place called St. Giles Farm. Very nice place, although slightly alarming reading material on the bedside table, The Joys of Rough Shooting. I kind of wondered, what kind of place am I at? But they were, in fact, very nice. Now, day 11 from Richmond or from St. Giles Farm to Ingleby Arncliffe is the killer. It is the longest day of the entire trip. It's about 40 kilometers, and yet it's completely flat. So they always say it's actually not as bad as you think it's going to be. I chose not to take a packed lunch this day from my homestay, and that was a big mistake because in April there were no restaurants at all along the route. I even found a pub that had zero food in it, strangely enough. On this day from St. Giles Farm or from Richmond to Ingleby Arncliffe, do take a packed lunch. It is a long, long day. Day 12, Ingleby Arncliffe to Claybank Top. Claybank Top is actually not a place where anybody stays. You arrange with the place that you're staying in the nearby town to come and pick you up and then drop you off the subsequent day. This is another nice hilly but not too hilly day where you're going through a series of mounds in amongst farming area. Day 13, you get your cab back from the hotel you've been staying to Claybank Top, and you're going to Blakey Ridge. This is an interesting day because you're going through area that really has nobody in it. It's entirely depopulated, which is interesting for a smallish but heavily populated country like England. And eventually, you see way off in the distance a hotel that, if you're like me, reminds you a little bit of the Overlook Hotel from The Shining, and seems a little bit more like that the closer you get to it. It's in an area that has virtually nothing else around it, but is a really interesting place to stay. It's extremely windy there, and it has one of the best pubs on the entire route. Day 14 is Blakey Ridge to Grossmont, or Gromont, I'm not entirely sure how it's pronounced. You carry on through the hills, down into farming area. Find yourself in a nice area with stately homes and restaurants and inns and so on. And then finally, day 15. You thought we were never going to get here, but in fact we did. It's Grossmont to Robin Hood's Bay. And this is a fairly flattish day. You're doing a little bit of hills, but not too many. And this is, I believe, a monk's retreat from God knows when. Actually, the date's there, 17 something. Near a waterfall, there's a great little restaurant where you can get coffee and cake and sandwiches if you want to. You are nearly there, so you can feel yourself relaxing a little bit. And then you're going through a series of small towns and farmland, feeling yourself getting closer and closer and closer to the ocean at long, long last. And sooner or later, you see a signpost that tells you you are only 3.5 miles from Robin Hood's Bay. You are definitely in the home stretch. You can see I am absolutely thrilled at that. I was wondering if I would be able to make the entire 320 kilometers, and in fact I did, and no problem at all, not even a blister the entire way. And finally, here we are at the ocean. This is the North Sea, the other side of England. Coming into the town of Robin Hood's Bay, which also looks like a nice place to stay, even if you're not doing the coast-to-coast trek. You go down through the town, down to the waterfront, and walk down the boat ramp, and you are, believe it or not, finally at the ocean. And you can throw in that one rock that you took from the other side. Down here as well, there is another of those cairns showing the end to the coast-to-coast walk. You've finally made it. And here I am at the end. And of course, you have to celebrate with a glass of wine at the end. So that's the coast-to-coast walk. If your stamina and fitness are up to it, I would absolutely recommend this trip. And it really gives you a sense of accomplishment at the end. It helps that you've gone from one ocean to the other. The end marker really feels finally significant. So, hope you liked that, and try it out someday.